This. About 9 months ago, we did a drill at our facility specifically for an active shooter. So when it becomes a live event, we can work seamlessly with fire rescue, BSO, in order to ensure patient safety. I want to commend the pre-hospital personnel yesterday for all of their efforts and all the efforts at Broward Health North, Broward Health Main, and also Coral Springs Medical Center got a couple of patients as well. Specifically to Broward Health North, and I'll turn it over to Dr. Menendez and Puente about Broward Health Main. Broward Health North, we had a total of 9 patients. One was the suspect, treated and released. We had 2 patients deceased. 3 patients have been discharged. We currently have 3 patients in the hospital, one with an extremity wound who's doing well and working with physical therapy, another patient who's still intubated after penetrating trauma to the chest, but is doing well and following commands, and a 3rd patient that remains intubated in critical condition. Dr. Menendez.
Yes. I'm Benny Menendez. I'm the director for the emergency department at Broward Health Medical Center. So yesterday was a tragedy that we all as a team took care of all these patients. We, our facility, received 7 patients. Of the 7 patients, right now we have 2 patients that they're critical, stable condition. The other 5 went home or they're on the way home and they're, in good condition. The other 2 that they're critical, stable condition, I have Dr. Puente, who's the trauma surgeon who was dealing with them. So if you have any question about those, you can tell them.
Thank you, Dr. Menendez. Again, I'm Ivan Puente. I'm the Trauma Medical Director at Broward Health Medical Center. And unfortunately, this is becoming routine for us now. It's the 2nd such episode that we've had in a year, which is very sad. And the first thing I want to say is that this second time around, just like the first time around, the first responders did a terrific job. And for those of you who understand what we do in trauma, time is of the essence. And really the delivery of those patients by that EMS personnel was fantastic yesterday, and it made a huge difference in the outcomes. As Dr. Menendez said, we received 7 patients. 1 was discharged last night. We had 1 that was in critical condition that went to surgery. We had 2 more stable patients that also require surgery. We have there's still, out of the 6 still left in the hospital, we're hoping to be able to send home 2 of them today, but I expect that all of them will fully recover. I'll be happy to take any questions.
Special Agent Cruz, can you please tell us, are you prepared to tell us that Nikolas Cruz is the same person who wrote that YouTube comment? Is it the same person? Can you comment more about this YouTube post?
We do not know if it's the same person. We did our database checks. We could not positively identify him. We're going back. We're scrubbing the information. We're looking at it again. But I'm not willing to say at this time that it was one and the same person.
Sheriff, was anyone specifically targeted? Is there any indication that someone was specifically targeted that started all of this?
Not at this time. That's certainly a possibility. But as I said earlier, the FBI, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, and Broward Sheriff's Office will be working conjunctively to interview as many people as we can. So down the road, we can uncover this information. But at that time, that's just, right now, it's no more than a possibility.
Do you know how he entered the building, how he got in?
That'll be, we will speak about that. We do know about that, and at our next press conference, as I said, I will take the media through a timeline and talk about through videotapes. We'll match up video with real-time information with things we know, and we'll disseminate that.
Sheriff, you said you were worried about when he received the weapon. Hi, Sheriff. What can you tell us about how Cruz obtained this AR? Understanding it was
Glenna, we're not going to release that until later today, if we do it all today. That's something that alcohol, tobacco, and firearms, those investigators are trying to track down the history of this weapon. We believe we know where the weapon was purchased, where the weapon came from, but that's being pieced together. So that will be something that we will discuss when at the appropriate time.
Airport shooting last year, now this tragic shooting. What can you tell the people of Broward County? What else can be done for their safety?
As I said, I talk about this all the time. It's not a phrase. It's not a term. It's the way we have to live our lives in circa 2018. If we see something, we need to say something. If that neighbor comes home every Friday at 4 o'clock and he or she's always carrying a grocery bag and there's milk and eggs sticking out, and the last 2 Fridays they've gone to a different, maybe a range, and they've come back with bullets in the bag on Fridays, that's a change in behavior. That's different. That's something we need to know about. You know, you're our eyes and ears. Well, one community member who sees something could do more in a 1-minute phone call than sometimes law enforcement could do in a period of months. If you know anybody right now, if you know anybody and you're saying, you know what, this raises a red flag, I was thinking of calling us. Don't think about calling us. Call us. Call the FBI. Call the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. Call the Broward Sheriff's Office. But if there's something in your gut that tells you there's something not right with this person has the capabilities in my mind to do this or do that, please don't remain silent. Please let us know about it.
And there you hear a strong and emotional plea for support and help from the Broward County Sheriff Scott Israel, who opened up this press conference with top officials from the state of Florida and the community, noting that they had received copycat threats there in the area, and him letting them know that anybody who's doing that is going to be prosecuted to the maximum extent of the law. He called those copycat calls horrific and pathetic. Interestingly, the sheriff also making a plea to people to contact their state legislators, lawmakers in Congress, so that people who have mental illness cannot get their hands on a gun. He also asked for specific powers that would allow law enforcement officials to involuntarily commit someone to a mental institution if they're posting pictures of themselves with weapons, talking about violence, because we know in this case that the alleged perpetrator of this crime was doing just that. He was posing on social media with an AR-15. He may have been talking on social media about committing acts of violence in school, and very strong remarks there. And even the Governor Rick Scott, their Republican governor, saying he's going to go back to Tallahassee, the capital of Florida, talk to them about other lawmakers about how they can keep guns out of the hands of those who are mentally ill.
Yeah, he was a former student at this school, but the kids that had gone to school with him were not surprised when they heard that he was a shooter. They said he was very angry, very violent, and had made a lot of threatening things against the school and against students in the past. And it's all, when you look on his Facebook page, you can see the way he was posing and the things that he said and what he wanted to do. It's all there in the open.
We're looking at a picture, too, of the diplomatic room inside the White House, because President Donald Trump is going to make his first comments about this. He has tweeted about it, but we are expecting to hear him make some comments shortly, and we'll bring that to you live.
The president spoke after the shooting in Las Vegas, and here in the same remarks was urged to speak about this attack. It's interesting on that question of involuntarily questioning somebody. That would be an extraordinary thing, and based solely on, I mean, there will be a lot of legal questions about that, but then a secondary one is if you're involuntarily questioning them or treating them for mental health problems, what happens if they already, as what appears to be the case in this case, own a firearm of some sort? Do you involuntarily restrict their access to that? That's been a big debate.
The Republican governor.
All right, we've just been watching a CBS News special report. In Florida, what you're seeing right there is the sheriff who's been talking, taking questions. Prior to that, a representative from the school district, a school superintendent, was also talking. Are we going to dip into the sheriff talking? All right, let's dip back into the sheriff.
Revoke something that President Obama had done that would
a whole plethora of things, and we want to go fast, but we're not going to rush it. We're going to get it right before we get it fast, and that's what's going on right now.
Governor Scott, there's a real conversation about situations like this.
Do students in the school know who to report concerns to? If they were concerned about a classmate, is there a protocol or a system or something?
You'd have to. I'm sure there is. I mean,
Did he cooperate?
He wasn't enrolled in. There is a process. They could get a hold of teachers, guidance counselors, their parents, make anonymous calls to Crime Stoppers. If somebody knows something, there's certainly ample way to say yes.
Governor Scott, isn't there a way?
Well, we had a school resource deputy, Deputy Peterson. He was on campus and he was armed. He never encountered, at this point, the only thing I can tell you definitively is he never encountered Cruz.
Governor Scott, you said you want to have a real conversation about how to prevent something like this from happening. Does that real conversation include gun control? Can you tell Floridians today that's something that you'll look into?
The two things I want to focus on when I have this conversation next week with state leaders is I want to focus on school safety. Now that's going to focus on dollars. It's going to focus, as the superintendent said, on mental health dollars. It's going to focus on what are the things we can do with regard to school safety. But on top of that, we've got to think about this. If somebody's mentally ill, they should not have access to a gun. So I want to focus on both of those things. I've already spoken to the Speaker of the House and the Senate President, and they're receptive to having this conversation about school safety. All of us have children, or grandchildren, nieces or nephews. None of us want this, anything like this to happen again. Let me also say something. I should have said something in Spanish earlier. Mis oraciones están con las víctimas y las familias que afectadas por esta tragedia. Como gobernador es muy importante para mí que todos los estudiantes en la Florida estén seguros.
Governor, question: is it diagnosis that he's mentally ill? It seems like there's a big focus on mentally ill. Is he mentally ill? Is that a diagnosis, or is this something that we're assuming because he killed so many people, or at least charged with that?
I think it's a pretty good assumption to start out with. Yes.
Governor, thank you. Can you sort of forecast for us the conversations you plan to have with lawmakers next week? How will they be different from the conversations you had with them after the last few mass shootings?
Right. But let's remember this. First off, Pulse was a terrorist attack. And after Pulse, I asked for money, and the legislature supported adding more counterterrorism experts through our Florida Department of Law Enforcement, and we did that. We, I think, added 46 additional counterterrorism experts, so we did that. In this case, what we have to think about is all of our schools have to be safe. It's as simple as that. How do we do that? It's going to be funding. It's going to be is there both for security, for mental illness, for counselors, things like that. But on top of that, we've got to say to ourselves, if we have somebody that's mentally ill, they can't have access to a gun. So, but look, I'm open to having a conversation about things because I don't want my children, your children, my grandchildren, your grandchildren, ever anything to go through like this. I don't want a parent to have to say, oh, I've got to teach you now when you start kindergarten that you've got to learn how to be careful about a shooter. That's not this society we all want to live in.
Is he cooperating?
I also, we have out here today, I'm flanked by many of our school board members, our elected officials on the school board, Dr. Rosalind Osgood, Abby Freeman, Donna Corn, and a host of others, and we appreciate them being out here, and we're going to make sure that they're part of the conversations too, because they deeply care about their students and this community, so I'm glad to see them here today. A few more questions.
Is he cooperating, and what has Cruz said to you at this point?
Yeah, we're not going to release anything he said to detectives.
Sheriff, we keep hearing over and over that if you hear or see something suspicious, to report it.
Right.
If someone came forward to your agency with information about this suspect, what could you legally have done about the fact that he owned a gun?
Well, if he legally owned a gun, we couldn't do anything about arresting him for having a gun because you used the word legally. But we could certainly follow up. We could certainly go to visit him, whether he legally owns a gun or not. If we think a red flag goes up and that there's something not right, and we think that this person has a propensity to do such a horrific act, I think police all over this nation need to be empowered to take that person and medically deliver him to a medical or her to a medical facility where they can be examined. Thank you for your time. We'll be back in about an hour.
In 2017, did you talk to Cruz? What time?
Okay, we've just been listening to officials down there in Florida, the Broward County Sheriff, representative from the FBI, as well as Governor Rick Scott, bringing us up to date. We are also waiting to hear from the president. He's expected to speak shortly. He said he would wait till this press conference was done and over with. A CBS News special report is ongoing right now, so let us dip right back into that.
In about a year, he was living with a family. He's had a very troubled life. You know, his father died some time ago. His mother died back in November of an illness. He's been living with family friends who said they just wanted to take in a troubled kid. They had been living with him, and they said, yeah, we knew that he was troubled, but they thought that he was getting better.
It's an extraordinary thing, though, if you're going to try and involuntarily take people from their home. And one of the reasons this has there's been some difficulty, and one of the reasons President Trump removed those mental health restrictions on getting gun licenses is that the gun advocates, those who are Second Amendment supporters, say that the definition gets very fuzzy and that people get put on lists without the proper, and so that would be certainly one of the things that would be discussed here.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things Obama tried to do is if you're getting a Social Security check for disability for a mental illness, you shouldn't be allowed to purchase a gun. That was one of the sort of avenues that they were able to use executive power for. Trump rescinded that. And so that's one of the things I bet is going to be part of this debate as we move forward.
And one of the questions that everybody wants to know is why does a 19-year-old or anybody have an assault rifle? He's 19 years old. He was working at the dollar store. They're very expensive weapons. How does he have the money to get that? And it also begs that question. How did this young man get this weapon?
Well, legally, we'll go to Jeff Pegues, who's in Washington with some reporting on the social media background of the shooter. Jeff?
Well, yeah, I think the day after, it's pretty clear that there were warning signs missed here. And this morning, I spoke with a man from Mississippi. His name is Ben Benight, who says that he warned the FBI last September about someone who posted on his YouTube channel a comment that said, "I'm going to be a professional school shooter." Now, Benight says that that was Nikolas Cruz who posted that comment, and that alarmed him. And so he reached out to the FBI. The FBI came out to talk to him. They spent about 20 minutes with Benight asking him about that comment to his YouTube post. He also told me that yesterday the FBI was back at his house after the shooting to, again, ask him more questions about this. And again, they spent about 20 minutes together. Now, we reached out to the FBI about this. Did they miss this warning sign? Did they have any contact with Cruz? And what they told us this morning, that they weren't going to comment. But of course, we heard in that news conference that they did check this tip out. And they checked their database. But what it came down to was that they were unable to match Cruz to that comment. So that's where this stands. But the question is, did they have any contact with Cruz at all leading up to this shooting, or did other law enforcement agencies have any contact with him?
Jeff Pegues there in Washington. Yeah, thank you. That's right. As Jeff pointed out, I mean, we heard the FBI special agent in charge say there wasn't any location, time, identity, so they never was able to connect that post with the shooter. Let's listen now to the President of the United States.
My fellow Americans, today I speak to a nation in grief. Yesterday, a school filled with innocent children and caring teachers became the scene of terrible violence, hatred, and evil. Around 2:30 yesterday afternoon, police responded to reports of gunfire at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, a great and safe community. There, a shooter, who is now in custody, opened fire on defenseless students and teachers. He murdered 17 people and badly wounded at least 14 others. Our entire nation, with one heavy heart, is praying for the victims and their families. To every parent, teacher, and child who is hurting so badly, we are here for you, whatever you need, whatever we can do to ease your pain. We are all joined together as one American family, and your suffering is our burden also. No child, no teacher should ever be in danger in an American school. No parent should ever have to fear for their sons and daughters when they kiss them goodbye in the morning. Each person who was stolen from us yesterday had a full life ahead of them, a life filled with wondrous beauty and unlimited potential and promise. Each one had dreams to pursue, love to give, and talents to share with the world. and each one had a family to whom they meant everything in the world. Today we mourn for all of those who lost their lives. We comfort the grieving and the wounded. And we hurt for the entire community of Parkland, Florida, that is now in shock and pain and searching for answers. To law enforcement, first responders, and teachers who responded so bravely in the face of danger, we thank you for your courage. Soon after the shooting, I spoke with Governor Scott to convey our deepest sympathies to the people of Florida and our determination to assist in any way that we can. I also spoke with Florida Attorney General Pam Bondi and Broward County Sheriff Scott Israel. I'm making plans to visit Parkland, to meet with families and local officials, and to continue coordinating the federal response. In these moments of heartache and darkness, we hold on to God's word in Scripture. I have heard your prayer and seen your tears. I will heal you. We trust in that promise, and we hold fast to our fellow Americans in their time of sorrow. I want to speak now directly to America's children, especially those who feel lost, alone, confused, or even scared. I want you to know that you are never alone and you never will be. You have people who care about you, who love you, and who will do anything at all to protect you. If you need help, turn to a teacher, a family member, a local police officer, or a faith leader. Answer hate with love, answer cruelty with kindness. We must also work together to create a culture in our country that embraces the dignity of life, that creates deep and meaningful human connections, and that turns classmates and colleagues into friends and neighbors. Our administration is working closely with local authorities to investigate the shooting and learn everything we can. We are committed to working with state and local leaders to help secure our schools and tackle the difficult issue of mental health. Later this month, I will be meeting with the nation's governors and attorney generals. Where making our schools and our children safer will be our top priority. It is not enough to simply take actions that make us feel like we are making a difference. We must actually make that difference. In times of tragedy, the bonds that sustain us are those of family, faith, community, and country. These bonds are stronger than the forces of hatred and evil, and these bonds grow even stronger in the hours of our greatest need. And so always, but especially today, let us hold our loved ones close. Let us pray for healing and for peace. And let us come together as one nation to wipe away the tears and strive for a much better tomorrow. Thank you, and God bless you all. Thank you very much.
And there you have the President of the United States promising that he's going to make this a top priority, to make schools safer, as he meets with governors and attorney generals from across the country.
And it was a very empathetic sounding President Trump, who says that no child, no teacher should ever be in danger in an American school. And I think that's what's hitting everybody today. You know, we say the school should be a safe place, yet this has been the 18th school shooting this year. It's the worst since Newtown, the Sandy Hook shooting in Newtown. That was in December 2012. And many thought finally that will make a difference. Maybe then there will be some changes, that kids can go to school and not have to worry about it. But yet here we we are, these years later, it is still a big problem in this country.
Major Garrett is at the White House. Major, what did you hear different from the president?
Not much. The president really did the logistics of yesterday, which most of the country is already well familiar with, described the need to come together. He's done that before after mass shootings. And if the country in any way, shape, or form was yearning for some recognition that firearms played a role in this catastrophe, you got none of that from President Trump. Only a focus on mental health, which has been sort of the place that the Republican Party and President Trump has leaned on in the aftermath of mass shootings. But if you look at the actual record of this administration dealing with mental health, when there was a conversation on Capitol Hill about repealing and replacing the Affordable Care Act, there were cuts to Medicaid there, long-term cuts. Medicaid is one of the frontline parts of the American bureaucracy that deals with mental health, especially for those who don't have access to mental health through their insurance of their own. And when the budget deal was just reached last week, Democrats fought for community health centers and other mental health advocacy that the White House in the aftermath said was just silly domestic spending that the president wishes he did not have to fund in order to fund defense spending. And as you mentioned before the president talked, Nora, about this law the president signed in February nullifying an Obama administration order about Social Security databases, and those who received Social Security checks who were so mentally ill they couldn't either function in a workplace or even manage their own finances. That was to be merged with background check databases at the federal level. The president eradicated that. Even after the Las Vegas mass shooting, there's a conversation about bump stocks, and did that lead to a greater degree of lethality in Las Vegas? There's an ongoing look into possibly regulating that, but there's no sense here at the White House that has any real velocity behind it, or the administration has prioritized that. So when the president talks about these priorities, you have to look at the actions behind them, and they don't really match up.
Excellent reporting and analysis there, Major, putting all of this in perspective. As rhetoric comes from lawmakers and leaders in Washington all the time, the question is whether their action matches what they say they're going to do to prevent such types of mass shootings again in the future.
That's right. And if this were easy, it would have been solved. And so it requires sustained hard work when no one is looking to handle these kinds of issues. And so it's the commitments are one thing, but the follow-through is more important.
I keep thinking about those families, Gail.
I do too, Nora. I keep thinking about the family we reported on earlier today where one child survived and one didn't. And I think all of us as parents at the table, the one thing you want to count on is that when you send your kids off to school, that they are going to be safe. And that is not the case as we sit here in 2018. And it's heartbreaking that this keeps happening over and over again.
And the man on the front lines, that sheriff, says parents need to call their legislators.
Right.
Coverage will continue throughout the day on your local news on the CBS station and on our 24-hour streaming network, CBSN. Watch it at cbsnews.com.
And there will be a full wrap-up tonight when Jeff Glor anchors the CBS Evening News from South Florida.
Many of you will return now to CBS This Morning. This has been a CBS News Special Report. I'm Gail King with John Dickerson and Nora O'Donnell, reporting to you from CBS News in New York.
For news 24 hours a day, go to cbsnews.com.
Right on the heels of that special report, we have Speaker Paul Ryan. He is addressing this tragedy in Florida as well.
We'll
take you there.
Find out as facts come out whether there was a breakdown in the system or not here today. As you also know, we passed legislation cleaning up the instant check background check system. That bill, with others, is sitting over in the United States Senate. So if there's someone who's not supposed to get a gun who's getting a gun, then we got to figure out why that's happening and fix that. That's a legislation. That's a piece of legislation we already passed that's sitting in the Senate. And one thing we know is if there are early indications for mental illness, I think we probably have to do a better job of trying to make sure that people don't get slipped through the cracks. Yeah.
Mr. Speaker, should law enforcement be able to confiscate a weapon from someone who has exhibited signs of mental illness?
Like I said before, this is not the time to jump to some conclusion, not knowing the full facts. We've got a lot more information we need to know. But if someone who is mentally ill is slipping through the cracks and getting a gun, because we have laws on the books, we have a system to prevent people who aren't supposed to get guns from getting guns. And if there are gaps there, then we need to look at those gaps. That's like the legislation we passed, fixing the NICS system.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, why won't you support or allow hearings to move forward on background checks? What is your resistance to that?
The fixed NICS bill, which is part of our broader bill, does fix the background check system. Remember the shooting in Texas. There was a man who had been convicted in the Air Force of domestic violence. He wasn't supposed to get a gun, yet the Air Force didn't give the records to the instant check system, and he got a gun. That's one of the reasons why we passed legislation plugging that loophole, making sure that that was the case. So that came from hearings. We had hearings on the gaps in the instant check system, and those hearings led to a conclusion that there were gaps that need to be fixed, and that led to legislation that has been now passed the House.
The question, I think, is, so you're saying that obviously we need to look into if there's gaps. The Attorney General this morning also said if there's problems, we've got to address it. Something is not right. There's something we've got to fix. Would you consider a select committee, whatever you call it, on this issue?
I think Congress should do its job, and that's what we've been. Look, we passed mental health legislation 2 years ago because of the underlying mental health problems that were behind these shootings. That legislation is now just taking place. That legislation is now being implemented. We, from early reportings, understand that there may be some mental health issues with this shooting. So the question is, are those laws where they need to be? Is it being implemented properly? Are they being enforced correctly? Remember, we do have laws on the books designed to prevent people with mental illnesses from getting firearms, to design people who have criminal backgrounds from getting firearms. The question is, just like the Texas instance, are those laws working the right way? Are there loopholes that need to be plugged? We found some loopholes that needed to be plugged, and we passed a bill to plug those loopholes. Andy.
Would you consider moving this fixed NICS legislation as a standalone bill, or do you consider insisting on these provisions that were sought by the National Rifle Association?
Our bill is in the Senate. Hopefully the Senate can pass something, then we'll meet them in conference like the regular legislative process.
I understand there's some provisions there. What is it, concealed carry?
I think that's a good self-defense bill. So that's something that's in the Senate. We'll see if the Senate can get to conference, and then we can figure out what we can do from there.
Mr. Speaker.
So there we're hearing from Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan. You know, once again, his focus, like many of the lawmakers that we've heard from this afternoon, including Governor Rick Scott and the President of the United States, has been pivoting towards mental health and whether or not there's enough being done to stop people with mental health issues from accessing these guns. He also talked about something else. He talked about loopholes in the background check system and mentioned the fact that the House passed some sort of legislation to close up those loopholes, but the Senate has not moved on that legislation thus far. But the focus continues to be on mental health. And, you know, Vlad, the conversation about mental health is an interesting one because how you define and how you determine who is too mentally ill to purchase a gun is something that I think is a difficult thing to hammer out. Is it to the degree where they could use mental health or a mental illness as a legal defense in a court case? Because that's very extreme. In this case, we don't know enough about this young man. We know that he was troubled. We know that perhaps he might have been depressed. After all, both of his parents were deceased. He was now an orphan. But is that the kind of mental health issues that politicians are really talking about? Could you really pass a law, is the question. Could you really pass a law that would limit somebody like that from accessing a gun? We really don't know. And we don't know at this point whether or not he got that gun legally or not, but all signs seem to point to the fact that he legally purchased that gun.
It's an interesting question. It's one that lawmakers are going to be wrestling with, Anne-Marie. The other thing that I was struck by in listening to the press conference, there were two things. One, when Robert Lasky, the FBI special agent, talked a little bit about the timeline that they were notified the FBI was in 2017. Now, here's the thing. We've been talking all morning long about folks that perhaps witnessed or saw something that was troublesome about this individual that they thought was striking, some of the things he was posting on social media. Well, it turns out that somebody did see something and somebody did say something. The FBI, the special agent Robert Lasky, saying in 2017 that he had posted in YouTube, "I'm going to be a professional school shooter." Now, what I find really interesting, and it'll be good to get our Justice and Homeland Security correspondent Jeff Pegues' take on this, the FBI agent in charge went on to say that they were unable to identify who had made those comments, that his name was put through some kind of a database, and they tried to scour his and try to understand who posted it, and they were unable to do so. So there are a lot of questions there, right? You know, whether or not the FBI was able to figure out his IP address, whether or not the information was with YouTube and the FBI doesn't have access to it. That's another question, a larger issue about technology companies and law enforcement. And the other one, where the sheriff said that if you have these mental health issues that you're talking about, Anne-Marie, that people may be upset that rights would be trampled, but that he feels law enforcement should take action, involuntary action, he said.
Yeah, there's always an issue of privacy. I want to pick up on that in a little bit, Vlad, but I want to head over to Major Garrett. He's been standing by for us. Major, you heard what the president had to say, his remarks. We've talked about this earlier. He definitely, like we've heard before, had a focus on mental health. He also mentioned that he was going to be heading down to Florida and visiting with family members. But what was your take on his remarks to the nation?
Very consistent with remarks he's made after the other 2 mass shootings on his watch as President of the United States. A kind of a recitation of the logistics, which most of the country already knows, talking about coming together, grief, tears, the heroism of the first responders, support for law enforcement, coordinating the federal and state and local response, all of that very typical. And then, to the degree he was looking at the underlying problem, identified it as one of mental health, not access to firearms or the particular lethality of the firearms involved. And that's been consistent for this president. It's consistent in the Republican response. Republicans control the House and the Senate. And when these mass shootings occur, there are 2 responses typically. We need to gather all the facts, don't jump to any conclusions, meaning don't even discuss potential gun control legislation as a remedy, and then also talking about the underlying issues of mental health. But as Vlad and you were discussing, look, it is very difficult to comprehensively describe what is mental illness and what is disqualifying in a mental health category, in any sense, disqualifying you from any number of things. And let me try to be specific in the terms of the gun control debate itself, and how those who are Second Amendment advocates, gun rights advocates, have said, you know, when the federal government gets involved in databases, for example, the Don't Fly list, errors can be made, people's due process can be violated, and it's been on that basis that gun rights advocates, those who want very strong Second Amendment protections, have said to the federal government, these lists can be full of errors and you're denying people their Second Amendment rights. So if this country and the politicians we're hearing from now believe that you can create a unified mental health definition that will deny someone access to firearms in all cases, that's simply not true. And it's simply not going to happen. Because even on something that is far easier to define, a no-fly list for commercial airline travel, that has been contested. You want to try to do something that is even more granular, that's even more difficult to define in terms of underlying causes, results, and diagnosis? Mental health is much more complicated. So when mental health becomes sort of the buffer answer after mass shootings, and there's no dialogue or quote-unquote conversation about the firearms involved, access to them, and their lethality, that's really separating this conversation into 2 distinct categories. And you get the feeling that those who are around these issues, who have been victimized by them and traumatized by them, are beginning to look for a political response that is more directed toward the firearms side of the equation than strictly the mental health side of the equation.
Indeed, and you know, when we're talking about mental health, unlike maybe something that might get you on a no-fly list, we're not talking about maybe, you know, associations, friends, comments that you might have made online. Our information, our health care information is heavily protected in this country. It's
by law.
Exactly. Violating that or bending the rules for that, I think there would be a tremendous amount of pushback, particularly from privacy advocates. Jeff Pegues, you're standing by. Jeff, you heard Vlad talk about the representative from the FBI who spoke about being alerted to statements that the suspect made online, saying that he wanted to be a school shooter. What I thought was really interesting about that is exactly what Vlad pointed out, that they mentioned they could not go any further with that information because they couldn't identify who was responsible for putting that stuff on YouTube. Can you talk a little bit about the role of these companies, these online companies? I don't understand why the FBI can't go to YouTube and say, disclose who's behind this comment.
Well, we don't know exactly what happened in this case. However, in other cases, the FBI has had a good relationship with organizations like Twitter and Facebook and YouTube. So there are areas where they cooperate. In this case, it has been reported that YouTube took that comment down. We've reached out to YouTube. We haven't heard back. But that is a legitimate question. Why wasn't the FBI able to match person to that comment? That is a good question, and perhaps that's a gap that needs to be addressed. But what is clear is, and I talked to the person who says that he notified the FBI, his name is Ben Benight, he's in Mississippi. He says that he alerted the FBI to this comment on one of his YouTube channels from someone that he says was Nikolas Cruz, who said, quote, "I'm going to be a professional school shooter." So that was the kind of comment that alarmed this Ben Benight. And so he reached out to the FBI. They came and they talked to him for about 20 minutes. But he did not hear again from the FBI until last night after the shooting. And then the FBI came back out to this Mississippi man's house and they questioned him again for about 20 minutes. So there were some warning signs there. The FBI in this news conference has said that it was not able to make that match. It checked its database, but still could not make that match. Now they're telling us they're going back and they're going to take another look. So we'll have to see what they ultimately determine. But what is clear is, I think we could all sit here and list probably 10 or 15 things that we've discovered over the last 12 hours or so that appear to be missed warning signs in this case. Whether it's the social media postings where this alleged shooter is brandishing weapons. There were several warning signs, or it could be the school officials who expelled him. And there were students who were saying that he was not allowed back on school grounds with a backpack. So there are several different warning signs here that people in the community clearly knew about. How much did law enforcement know about? That's a question that we're going to keep asking. But this is not one of those mass shootings where you can say, oh, this was hard to prevent.
That is so correct, and I think that is what I find so frustrating about this case. If you see something, say something. A complete stranger did. The FBI followed up on that stranger's concerns. Now, we don't know exactly all that the school did, but I presume before expelling someone from the school, there is some sort of intervention, whether it's a social worker at the school or something along those lines. Typically, a student isn't just expelled without something leading up to that. And we've heard, about this mental health stuff. We've heard about if you see something, say something. We've heard about school security, and certainly it seems like in this case, this is a school that kept their doors locked until the children were ready to leave for the day, which is exactly what this is. This is a school that practiced these sort of drills, maybe not active shooter drills, but certainly code red drills. So these children knew what to do. They went back to their classrooms and hunkered down. The only other bit sort of left to have in this conversation is about this gun. But sorry, go ahead, Jeff.
Well, I was just going to say, yeah, they trained for this. But what happened yesterday was this shooter pulled the fire alarm. So any training that you have sort of goes out the door. Why? Because the kids are going to react to the fire alarm.
Actually,
which says go out,